In the hushed depths of Richmond Palace, a chill wind whispering through the corridors on a bleak March morning in 1603, a discovery was made that would send tremors through the very foundations of the English court. Amidst the meticulously arranged personal effects of England's formidable monarch, a letter lay concealed, its contents so unsettling, so steeped in shadows that it was immediately sequestered from public view. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who had steered England through turbulent waters for 45 years, had met her end under circumstances far more treacherous than the sanitized narratives offered by history books would suggest. The revelations contained within that letter hinted at a grim truth. Her demise was not the serene passing of a queen in her twilight years, but rather the culmination of a protracted, deliberate poisoning, possibly self-inflicted, a tragic consequence of her relentless pursuit of eternal youth. This was a queen whose reign was marked by extraordinary achievements, the thwarting of the Spanish Armada, the transformation of England into a formidable maritime power, and the indelible mark she left upon an entire epoch. Yet her final years were a stark contrast, a descent into a self-imposed prison constructed of vanity and the relentless need to preserve her fading beauty. The very makeup she meticulously applied, in attempt to maintain her legendary allure, became the instrument of her destruction, a testament to the dark undercurrents of Tudor politics where survival was a constant dance with deception, and even monarchs were vulnerable to those who pledged allegiance. This is not the idealized portrait of Gloriana painted in classrooms. This is the unvarnished account of a woman ensnared between the unyielding demands of power and the suffocating constraints of femininity, whose desperate endeavors to immortalize her image may have exacted the ultimate price. The evidence points to a chilling conclusion. Elizabeth I did not simply succumb to old age. She was slowly and agonizingly murdered, perhaps by choices she herself made, a protracted tragedy etched in the annals of history. Elizabeth Tudor's ascent to the throne was a treacherous path, paved with the blood of those who challenged her claim. From the very moment of her conception, as the daughter of Henry VIII and his ill-fated second wife, Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth was thrust into a world where her legitimacy was questioned by much of Europe. Her father's obsessive pursuit of a male heir had already irrevocably severed England from the Catholic Church, plunging the nation into a maelstrom of religious discord. When Elizabeth was a mere 2 years old, she witnessed a horrific spectacle that would indelibly shape her perception of power and vulnerability: the systematic destruction of her own mother. Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536 was not a swift, merciful act. Henry VIII, driven by a desperate need to legitimize his actions, orchestrated a calculated campaign of character assassination, portraying Anne as an adulteress, a sorceress, and a traitor to the crown. The young Elizabeth, barely comprehending the machinations unfolding around her, watched as her mother was stripped of her royal title, her marriage declared null and void, and her very existence erased from official records. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was led to the executioner's block at the Tower of London, where a French swordsman, specifically brought in for the occasion, severed her head with a single swift stroke. Elizabeth, branded illegitimate, was suddenly orphaned and stripped of her status, existing solely at the whim of a father who had demonstrated his willingness to execute even those he professed to love. The profound psychological trauma of this event cannot be overstated. Elizabeth grew up with the chilling knowledge that her father had orchestrated the murder of her mother, that her very birth had been the catalyst for this tragic demise, and that her own survival hinged entirely on her ability to appease a man capable of such ruthless acts. The Tudor court was a brutal environment where children learned that affection was fleeting, power was paramount, and even the most intimate relationships could turn deadly without warning. Henry's subsequent marriages and divorces only reinforced these harsh realities. Elizabeth witnessed her father's union with Jane Seymour, who died giving birth to the long-awaited male heir, Edward. She observed the swift annulment of Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves and the horrifying execution of Catherine Howard, her fifth stepmother, who was dragged, screaming, to the block for alleged infidelity. Each marriage, each divorce, each execution served as a brutal lesson for Elizabeth. Survival in the treacherous Tudor world demanded unwavering vigilance and absolute self-control. The young princess learned to navigate this perilous landscape by becoming a master of deception, a chameleon capable of adapting to any circumstance. She excelled in her studies, mastering Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, recognizing that intelligence was her most reliable weapon. She cultivated an outward image of Protestant piety while harboring private doubts about all religious authority. Above all, she learned to decipher the subtle nuances of courtly politics, understanding that her life could depend on interpreting a fleeting glance, a carefully chosen gesture, or a loaded word. By the time Henry VIII breathed his last in 1547, Elizabeth had already honed the skills that would serve her so well as queen. The ability to present multiple personas to different audiences, a talent for speaking volumes while revealing nothing, and a deep understanding that power relied on the constant veiled threat of violence. She had learned that being a woman in power meant existing perpetually under suspicion, and that survival required sacrificing personal desires for the sake of political expediency. The trauma of her childhood forged the foundation for everything that would follow. Elizabeth's later obsession with her appearance, her calculated refusal to marry, her almost paranoid vigilance regarding loyalty, and ultimately, her tragic final years all stemmed from the lessons learned in those early, blood-soaked years when she discovered that even royal parents could become executioners. In October of 1562, at the relatively young age of 29, Queen Elizabeth I confronted what would become the defining crisis of her reign, and what many believe to be the genesis of her slow descent into the vanity that would ultimately prove fatal: smallpox. The dreaded disease, which had already claimed countless lives across Europe, struck the young queen with merciless force. For days, she teetered on the brink of death within the confines of Hampton Court Palace, her body consumed by fever, her counselors whispering anxiously about the succession in the corridors outside her chamber. When she finally emerged from the crucible of the illness, Elizabeth discovered that the disease had left her with something far more devastating than mere physical scars. It had irrevocably damaged the one asset she valued above all others: her legendary beauty. The smallpox had ravaged Elizabeth's face, leaving deep, disfiguring pockmarks across her skin, particularly on her forehead and cheeks. In an era where a monarch's physical appearance was regarded as a reflection of divine favor and a symbol of national strength, this disfigurement was not simply a personal setback. It was a political catastrophe with potentially far-reaching consequences. Elizabeth's renowned beauty had been one of her most potent diplomatic tools, wielded to charm foreign ambassadors, sway political alliances, and maintain the illusion that she might still marry to secure England's future. European courts had long described her as possessing skin as white as freshly fallen snow and a complexion that seemed to emanate an inner radiance. That captivating woman was now lost forever. The psychological impact of this profound transformation cannot be adequately expressed. Elizabeth had come of age understanding that her power was precarious, dependent on maintaining a delicate equilibrium between being alluring enough to attract powerful suitors, yet fiercely independent enough to avoid the constraints of marriage. Her beauty had been her armor, her most effective weapon, and her impenetrable shield. Deprived of it, she felt vulnerable in ways that extended far beyond the purely physical, exposed to the harsh realities of courtly intrigue and the potential erosion of her authority. Observers at court noted a significant shift in the Queen's behavior following her recovery. She became increasingly preoccupied with mirrors, spending countless hours each day scrutinizing her reflection and experimenting with a myriad of cosmetic treatments in a desperate attempt to recapture her lost allure. It was during this period of intense self-scrutiny that Elizabeth first encountered the seductive, yet ultimately deadly, allure of lead-based cosmetics that would eventually seal her fate. Venetian ceruse, a clandestine mixture of white lead and vinegar, promised to create the alabaster, flawlessly smooth complexion that was considered the epitome of beauty among European nobility. The substance was notoriously expensive, shrouded in exclusivity, and undeniably effective at concealing imperfections. When applied in sufficiently thick layers, it could completely mask the disfiguring pockmarks left by the smallpox, creating an artificial smoothness that mimicked her former radiance. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting later recounted the elaborate, almost ritualistic nature of the Queen's daily makeup application. Each morning, she would sit for hours as layers of ceruse were meticulously applied to her face, neck, and hands. The process was painstaking, demanding multiple coats to achieve the desired opacity and create the illusion of porcelain perfection. Over this toxic foundation, additional cosmetics were layered. Kohl meticulously applied around the eyes to enhance their sparkle, rouge crafted from mercury sulfide applied to the lips and cheeks to simulate a healthy flush, and delicate painted details designed to accentuate her features and soften the harsh lines of age. The immediate results were undeniably spectacular. Foreign ambassadors once again praised Elizabeth's captivating appearance, remarking on her alabaster skin and ethereal beauty. Marriage negotiations, previously stalled by concerns about her declining looks, resumed with renewed vigor as European princes once again vied for the hand of the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth had successfully harnessed the power of chemistry to resurrect her political power, but in doing so, she had unwittingly embarked on a course of slow, insidious poisoning that would gradually erode her health and ultimately claim her life over the course of 4 agonizing decades. The true tragedy of Elizabeth's post-smallpox transformation lay in its deceptive efficacy. The lead-based cosmetics not only concealed her scars, but also conjured an image of otherworldly perfection that became inextricably linked to her royal identity. She found herself trapped in a dangerous paradox. She could not abandon the makeup without revealing the ravaged skin beneath, thereby risking the erosion of her authority, and she could not continue using it without subjecting herself to daily doses of a deadly toxin. She had made a fateful choice, prioritizing beauty over health, political power over physical well-being, and in doing so, had irrevocably set herself on a path toward a slow, agonizing demise. What began as a seemingly innocuous cosmetic solution to camouflage the scars of smallpox gradually metastasized into something far more sinister, a daily ritual of self-inflicted poisoning that would persist for 40 years, an act of slow self-destruction masked as a pursuit of beauty. Elizabeth's elaborate makeup routine, which courtiers described as consuming up to 4 hours each morning, involved the systematic application of substances that modern science recognizes as some of the most hazardous chemicals known to humankind. The Venetian ceruse that formed the base of her flawless facade contained staggering concentrations of lead that would horrify contemporary toxicologists, while the additional cosmetics layered on top introduced a cocktail of mercury, arsenic, and other deadly compounds into her delicate system. The lead present in ceruse was particularly insidious because it was readily absorbed directly through the skin, bypassing the body's natural defenses and accumulating in the tissues over time. Unlike acute poisoning, which manifests in immediate and dramatic symptoms, chronic lead exposure produces a slow, almost imperceptible degradation of mental and physical function that can take years, even decades, to become apparent. Elizabeth's daily application of thick layers of lead-based makeup meant that she was receiving doses of this potent toxin that far exceeded what would be considered safe, even for industrial workers in the most unregulated environments. Contemporary accounts vividly depict the Queen's makeup as so thick and meticulously applied that it resembled a mask rather than traditional cosmetics, a layer of artifice separating her from the world. Visitors to court often remarked that Elizabeth's face appeared to be sculpted from marble, possessing an unnatural smoothness that seemed to glow unnervingly in the soft light of candlelight. This unsettling effect was achieved through the application of countless layers of ceruse, each building upon the last to create an almost porcelain-like surface devoid of any natural texture or blemish. This mask-like appearance became so inextricably linked to Elizabeth that many of her subjects had never actually seen her natural face and could only imagine the secrets hidden beneath the layers of paint. The psychological dependence that Elizabeth developed around this elaborate cosmetic routine was as treacherous as the physical poisoning itself. She became convinced that her power, her legitimacy, and her very identity depended on maintaining this meticulously crafted, artificial appearance. She vehemently forbade the creation of realistic portraits in her later years, insisting that all likenesses depict her with the smooth, ageless face conjured by her makeup. The famous Mask of Youth portraits that proliferated during the final decades of her reign were not merely artistic conventions. They were deliberate propaganda designed to conceal the harsh reality of her deteriorating condition and to project an image of unwavering strength and timeless beauty. The application process itself became increasingly elaborate and grueling as Elizabeth aged and the insidious effects of lead poisoning became more pronounced. Her ladies-in-waiting reported that the queen demanded ever thicker applications of ceruse to achieve the desired effect, as her natural skin became increasingly damaged, discolored, and riddled with imperfections. What had once been a relatively simple routine involving a few layers of makeup gradually transformed into a complex construction project, with cosmetics applied so thickly that they would often crack and flake throughout the day, necessitating constant touch-ups and repairs. The economic cost of this cosmetic routine was staggering, consuming vast sums of money that could have been used for the benefit of the realm. Elizabeth spent the equivalent of millions of dollars in modern currency on her makeup supplies, importing the finest ceruse from Venice and exotic pigments from across the known world. The Queen's cosmetic expenses represented a significant portion of the royal budget, reflecting both the immense importance she placed on her appearance and the ever-increasing quantities of makeup required to maintain the illusion of youth and beauty. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of this slow, agonizing decline was that Elizabeth seemed to possess a glimmer of awareness regarding the inherently dangerous nature of her cosmetic routine, yet she felt utterly powerless to abandon it. Several of her closest advisors, including the sagacious William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, implored her to reduce her reliance on makeup, particularly as alarming reports circulated about the premature deaths of other noble women attributed to cosmetic poisoning. Elizabeth's response was always the same, a chilling acknowledgement of her self-destructive dependence. She could not possibly appear before her subjects or foreign dignitaries without her face, as she chillingly referred to her mask of makeup. The artificial appearance had become so deeply ingrained in her identity as queen, so central to her ability to command respect and project authority, that removing it felt akin to abdicating the throne itself, surrendering to the ravages of time, and relinquishing her grip on power. As Elizabeth's reliance on lead-based cosmetics spiraled into an all-consuming obsession, the royal court metamorphosed into a grotesque theater of deception where the lines between reality and performance blurred to the point of indistinguishability. The Queen's burgeoning paranoia about her aging appearance prompted the installation of specially designed mirrors throughout her palaces, surfaces that had been subtly curved or tinted to cast a more flattering reflection, distorting reality to align with her desired image. These mirrors, crafted by skilled Venetian artisans at exorbitant expense, fostered an environment where Elizabeth could maintain the illusion that her cosmetic transformation was successful, even as her natural appearance continued to deteriorate beneath the poisonous mask. The insidious psychological effects of chronic lead poisoning began to manifest in Elizabeth's increasingly erratic behavior during the 1580s, casting a dark shadow over the court. While courtiers attributed her growing instability to the immense pressures of ruling a kingdom and navigating complex political intrigues, lead poisoning is known to produce a range of debilitating symptoms, including heightened irritability, impaired memory, difficulty concentrating, and unpredictable periods of confusion, all of which became increasingly apparent in the aging queen's actions. Her famous temper tantrums, which had once been carefully calculated displays of royal authority designed to intimidate rivals and enforce her will, became unpredictable outbursts of uncontrollable rage that terrified even her most trusted advisors, leaving them shaken and uncertain. The daily ritual of applying her makeup, once a source of fleeting satisfaction, gradually transformed into a form of agonizing torture that Elizabeth seemed unable to escape, a cruel reminder of her self-imposed prison. Her ladies-in-waiting described a process that was both physically painful and emotionally devastating. The lead-based ceruse burned her skin, causing persistent redness and intense irritation that required even more makeup to conceal, creating a vicious cycle of damage and concealment. The sheer weight of the cosmetics, applied in layers so thick they resembled plaster, caused excruciating headaches and severely restricted her facial expressions. Elizabeth's once radiant smile, once described as charming and alluring, became a rigid, almost grotesque grimace maintained by sheer force of will. The queen's desperate attempts to preserve her youthful appearance became increasingly desperate and bizarre, pushing the boundaries of reason and venturing into the realm of the macabre. She began experimenting with cosmetic techniques that bordered on the grotesque, including the application of raw meat to her face as a supposed anti-aging treatment, believing it would restore her youthful elasticity, and the reckless use of mercury-based compounds that promised to rejuvenate her natural complexion despite their known toxicity. These desperate measures, often recommended by well-meaning but woefully uninformed court physicians who possessed a limited understanding of chemistry, only exacerbated the toxic burden her body was already struggling to bear. Foreign ambassadors began to circulate disturbing observations about Elizabeth's increasingly alarming appearance and erratic behavior. The Venetian ambassador noted that the queen's hands trembled uncontrollably, her speech was often slurred and incoherent, and her memory appeared to be failing at an alarming rate. More alarmingly, he reported that her makeup had begun to take on a ghastly greenish tint, suggesting that the chemical reactions occurring on her ravaged skin were visible, even through the thick, suffocating layers of cosmetics. These unsettling reports, whispered throughout European courts, began to erode Elizabeth's diplomatic authority as foreign powers questioned whether she remained mentally and physically capable of effectively governing England and maintaining its strategic alliances. The most tragic aspect of this period of decline was Elizabeth's growing isolation, a consequence of her failing health and increasingly erratic behavior. As her mental state deteriorated and her appearance became more artificial and unsettling, she began to withdraw from public appearances and severely restrict access to her private chambers, retreating into a self-imposed exile. The queen, who had once thrived on the adulation of her subjects and the intricate games of diplomatic intrigue, became a recluse, emerging only for the most essential state functions. And even then, she insisted on appearing in dimly lit rooms where the full extent of her cosmetic transformation would be less apparent, and her failing health less conspicuous. The court, ever adaptable to the queen's shifting moods and deteriorating condition, developed an elaborate system of protocols designed to protect both the queen's fragile dignity and the courtiers' own safety. Specific rules governed how closely one could approach the queen, the appropriate lighting for audiences, and the acceptable topics of conversation, creating a carefully controlled environment where disaster could be averted. These protocols, presented as matters of royal etiquette and respect, were in reality safety measures designed to prevent situations where Elizabeth's true condition might be revealed to visitors or where her increasingly unpredictable behavior might lead to dangerous or embarrassing incidents. By the 1590s, the cumulative and devastating effects of 4 decades of chronic lead poisoning had irrevocably transformed Elizabeth I from England's most formidable and respected monarch into a tragic figure whose grip on reality was slowly and inexorably slipping away, a victim of her own vanity and the relentless pressures of courtly life. The queen, who had once commanded respect and admiration through her brilliant intellect, shrewd political acumen, and unwavering resolve, now struggled with even the most basic cognitive functions, her mental faculties dulled by the insidious effects of the toxic chemicals that had permeated her system. Although the elaborate court protocols surrounding her person made it exceedingly difficult for anyone to accurately assess the true extent of her decline, her closest and most trusted advisors found themselves managing not just a kingdom grappling with internal strife and external threats, but also an increasingly unstable ruler whose decisions could no longer be blindly trusted and whose judgment was often clouded by confusion and paranoia. The physical symptoms of chronic lead poisoning had become impossible to completely conceal despite the countless layers of cosmetics meticulously applied each morning in a desperate attempt to mask the ravages of time and the effects of the toxins that were slowly killing her. Elizabeth's hands, once praised for their elegance and graceful gestures, now trembled constantly, a condition her physicians attributed to a nervous disposition brought on by the stresses of governance, but which modern medicine would immediately recognize as a telltale sign of heavy metal toxicity. Her walk, once described as graceful and commanding, had become unsteady and faltering, requiring her to hold on to furniture or rely on the support of attentive courtiers to maintain her balance and prevent a fall. Most disturbingly, her famous red hair, once a symbol of her fiery spirit and regal authority, had begun to fall out in clumps, leaving unsightly bald patches that she desperately attempted to conceal beneath increasingly elaborate and heavy wigs designed to maintain her carefully constructed public appearance. The Queen's mental state exhibited even more alarming signs of deterioration, casting a long shadow over the court and fueling whispers of concern among her inner circle. She would frequently forget the names of longtime courtiers who had served her faithfully for decades, or become hopelessly confused about even the most basic facts of government, demonstrating a profound loss of cognitive function. During one particularly disturbing incident, Elizabeth was discovered in her private chambers engaged in an animated conversation with her reflection in a mirror, apparently believing she was conversing with her deceased mother, Anne Boleyn, reliving the traumas of her childhood and blurring the lines between past and present. Such episodes became increasingly frequent as the decade progressed, though they were carefully concealed from all but the most trusted members of her household, who were sworn to secrecy and fiercely loyal to the crown. Elizabeth's behavior toward her courtiers became increasingly erratic, unpredictable, and sometimes even violent, fueled by the toxic effects of lead on her nervous system and her growing sense of paranoia and isolation. She would fly into uncontrollable rages over trivial matters, unleashing torrents of verbal abuse and striking servants with her hands or whatever objects happened to be within her reach, a stark departure from her previous controlled demeanor. These outbursts were inevitably followed by periods of deep melancholy, where she would retreat into herself and refuse to speak for days at a time, lost in a sea of despair and regret. The psychological effects of lead poisoning, which include severe depression, debilitating anxiety, and profound personality changes, had combined with the natural aging process to create a ruler who was often unpredictable, emotionally volatile, and sometimes even physically dangerous, casting a pall of fear over the court. The makeup routine that had once been Elizabeth's salvation, a tool she wielded to project power and maintain her carefully constructed image, now became a form of daily torture, a painful reminder of her self-destructive dependence on artifice. The application process, which required her to remain motionless for hours on end, became physically agonizing as her body was increasingly racked with the tremors, muscle pain, and neurological dysfunction associated with lead poisoning, making it almost unbearable to sit still. Yet, she could not abandon the cosmetics without revealing the full extent of her physical deterioration, exposing the harsh reality of her aging and poisoned body to the world. Beneath the thick, suffocating layers of ceruse, her skin had become discolored, scarred, and lesioned, resembling ancient parchment more than human flesh, a testament to the corrosive effects of the toxins she had willingly applied for decades. The toxic cosmetics had essentially mummified her face while she was still alive, creating a grotesque parody of eternal youth. Perhaps most tragically, Elizabeth seemed to possess a flicker of understanding regarding what was happening to her, recognizing the role her own vanity had played in her slow demise. In private moments with her closest ladies-in-waiting, she would speak of feeling poisoned by beauty and express profound regret about the choices she had made, lamenting the path she had taken in pursuit of an unattainable ideal. Yet, she felt trapped by the image she had created, unable to appear before her subjects without the elaborate cosmetic transformation that was slowly killing her, a prisoner of her own carefully constructed facade. The Virgin Queen had become a prisoner of her own vanity, locked in a self-destructive cycle that she seemed unable to break, a tragic figure consumed by the very image she had so meticulously crafted. The kingdom itself began to suffer from Elizabeth's accelerating decline, as her physical and mental frailties hampered her ability to govern effectively. Important decisions were delayed for weeks, while the Queen struggled with periods of confusion or remained locked in her chambers during her darkest episodes, neglecting the affairs of state. Foreign policy became inconsistent and reactive as Elizabeth's fluctuating mental state affected her ability to maintain the complex diplomatic relationships that had made England a major European power, threatening the stability of the realm. The court, once a vibrant center of learning, culture, and political intrigue, became a place of hushed whispers, furtive glances, and careful navigation around an increasingly unstable monarch, as courtiers feared incurring her wrath or witnessing her moments of mental breakdown. The grim winter of 1602 marked the definitive beginning of Elizabeth Thirst's final descent into the madness and despair that would characterize her last months, a period of agonizing decline shrouded in secrecy and fueled by paranoia. The accumulated effects of 4 decades of relentless lead poisoning had finally reached a critical threshold, triggering a cascade of devastating symptoms that could no longer be effectively hidden from even the most casual observers, shattering the carefully constructed illusion of regal composure. The Queen, who had once been celebrated throughout Europe for her razor-sharp wit, formidable intellect, and shrewd political cunning, now struggled to maintain even the most basic coherent conversations, often stopping mid-sentence as if she had completely forgotten what she was saying, her thoughts scattered and her mental faculties fading. Her terrified courtiers watched in silent horror as the woman who had defined an age, who had steered England through perilous times and emerged victorious, slowly and agonizingly disappeared before their eyes, succumbing to the ravages of time and the insidious effects of the poisons that had infiltrated her system. The most disturbing manifestation of Elizabeth's deteriorating condition was her escalating obsession with death, the supernatural realm, and the haunting figures of her past, suggesting a profound detachment from reality. She began to report seeing vivid apparitions of people from her past, including her ill-fated mother, Anne Boleyn, and her half-sister, Mary Tudor, both victims of the ruthless Tudor dynasty. These unsettling hallucinations, which modern medicine would immediately recognize as symptoms of severe lead poisoning affecting the brain, convinced Elizabeth that she was being haunted by the vengeful ghosts of those who had suffered unjustly under Tudor rule, seeking retribution for their untimely deaths. She would spend countless hours talking to empty chairs, her voice a mere whisper, apparently carrying on one-sided conversations with these spectral visitors, replaying past events and reliving old traumas. Elizabeth's physical condition had become utterly grotesque, a macabre caricature of her former regal beauty. The decades of relentless application of lead-based cosmetics had left her natural skin so irreparably damaged that it could no longer heal properly, a toxic wasteland ravaged by chemical burns and irreversible scarring. Open sores and festering lesions covered her face and hands, weeping constantly and emitting a foul odor that even the strongest perfumes and incense could not effectively mask, creating an atmosphere of decay around her. Her once vibrant and lustrous hair, what little remained of it, had turned completely white, thinned dramatically, and fell out in clumps, leaving her scalp exposed and scarred. Most shockingly of all, her teeth had begun to turn black and crumble, a common and horrifying result of prolonged mercury poisoning caused by the rouge she had used for decades to simulate a healthy glow, further disfiguring her once captivating smile. The elaborate makeup routine that had once consumed a mere 4 hours now required entire days to complete, a desperate attempt to salvage some semblance of her former glory and conceal the horrors that lay beneath the layers of paint. Multiple layers of cosmetics were needed to create even the faintest resemblance of a human face, a Sisyphean task that had to be repeated several times each day as the sheer weight of the cosmetics caused them to crack and fall away, revealing the damaged skin beneath. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting described applying makeup so thickly that it resembled a grotesque death mask more than cosmetics, a horrifying testament to the lengths she would go to preserve her carefully constructed image. The Queen's face had become a never-ending construction project, rebuilt each day from toxic materials that were slowly and inexorably killing her, a grim metaphor for her self-destructive pursuit of eternal youth. Perhaps most tragically, Elizabeth's final months were marked by fleeting moments of terrible clarity, where she glimpsed the devastating consequences of her choices and recognized the role her own vanity had played in her downfall. In her rare lucid moments, she understood exactly what was happening to her and expressed profound regret about the decisions that had led her to her current state, lamenting the loss of her health, her sanity, and her connection to reality. She spoke of being devoured by vanity, and hauntingly described her face as a poison garden that had grown more deadly and treacherous with each passing year, reflecting on the toxicity of her own beauty. These moments of poignant insight were inevitably followed by periods of intense confusion, terrifying hallucinations, and delusional thinking that suggested her brain was being systematically destroyed by the heavy metals that had infiltrated her system, blurring the lines between reality and fantasy. The Queen's behavior became increasingly erratic, unpredictable, and sometimes even overtly dangerous, fueled by her deteriorating mental state and her growing sense of paranoia and desperation. She would fly into violent rages, hurling objects across the room and striking anyone who dared to approach her, a stark contrast to her previous self-control. During one particularly disturbing episode, she was discovered in her private chambers attempting to violently scrape the makeup from her face with her fingernails, driven by a desperate desire to remove what she called the poison mask that was suffocating her. The resulting wounds required weeks to heal and left permanent scars that necessitated even thicker applications of cosmetics to conceal, perpetuating the cycle of self-destruction. Elizabeth's final public appearance at the opening of Parliament in November 1602 shocked even those who had been closely following her precipitous decline, shattering the carefully constructed illusion of regal strength. Witnesses described a spectral figure that barely resembled the legendary Virgin Queen, propped up by elaborate clothing, heavy jewels, and layers of suffocating cosmetics, but clearly teetering on the brink of death. A mere shadow of her former self. Her speech was slurred, rambling, and largely incoherent, and she had to be physically supported by attentive courtiers to prevent her from collapsing, a humiliating display of her frailty. The woman who had once commanded the unwavering respect and fear of Europe's most powerful rulers had been reduced to a tragic spectacle, a living, breathing memento mori, a grim reminder of the fleeting nature of earthly power and the devastating price of vanity, a victim of her own pursuit of beauty at any cost. In the twilight weeks of Elizabeth I's life, as she lay confined to her bed in Richmond Palace, the Queen's behavior took on a newfound urgency, a desperate attempt to leave her mark on the world that alarmed even her most seasoned and unflappable courtiers, who had witnessed decades of royal eccentricities. Despite her rapidly deteriorating physical condition and increasingly frequent episodes of profound confusion, Elizabeth became consumed by a singular obsession, writing what she referred to as her final testament, a clandestine document that she labored over in utmost secrecy, often during the pre-dawn hours when the palace was shrouded in silence, and her mind seemed momentarily clearer, a desperate attempt to make sense of her life and legacy. This letter, which would be discovered among her personal belongings after her death, contained revelations so profoundly disturbing, so steeped in historical revisionism, that they were immediately suppressed by her successor, James I, and buried deep within the royal archives, fearing the damage they could inflict on the Tudor legacy. The Queen's secretive writing sessions were conducted in her most private chamber, a sanctuary where she allowed only her most trusted and devoted lady-in-waiting, Catherine Carey, to attend her, serving as both scribe and confidant. Carey later recounted finding Elizabeth hunched laboriously over her writing desk, her hands shaking violently as she struggled to form legible letters with a quill that seemed almost too heavy for her frail limbs to hold, a physical manifestation of her declining strength. The physical act of writing had become a torturous ordeal for the Queen, whose lead-poisoned nervous system could barely maintain control over her movements. Yet, she persisted with a desperate determination, fueled by a need to confess her innermost thoughts and confront the demons of her past. What made Elizabeth's final letter so profoundly shocking and historically significant was its raw, unflinching honesty about the true realities of her long reign and the immense price she had personally paid for wielding power, a stark contrast to the carefully crafted image of Gloriana that had been perpetuated for decades. In trembling handwriting that grew increasingly illegible as her condition worsened, she confessed to decades of calculated deception, skillful manipulation, and what she chillingly termed the slow suicide of vanity, an acknowledgement of her self-destructive obsession with beauty. The document revealed that Elizabeth had been fully cognizant of the inherent dangers of her elaborate cosmetic routine for years, understanding the toxic effects of the lead and mercury that she applied to her skin, but had felt utterly unable to abandon it without jeopardizing her political authority and surrendering her carefully constructed image, a prisoner of her own creation. She poignantly described her daily makeup application as a form of beautiful self-murder, a conscious act of slow poisoning that she had reluctantly chosen over the alternative of appearing before her subjects in her natural damaged state, risking ridicule and a loss of respect. Most disturbingly, the letter hinted that Elizabeth's cosmetic poisoning may not have been entirely accidental or solely the result of her own vanity, suggesting the possibility of a calculated conspiracy. She wrote cryptically of those who would see me painted into my grave, and subtly implied that certain members of her court had deliberately encouraged her increasingly dangerous beauty rituals while fully aware of their toxic effects and long-term consequences, raising unsettling questions about their motives. The Queen seemed to harbor a deep-seated belief that she had been the victim of a slow-motion assassination, not carried out with daggers or poisoned cups, but through the insidious manipulation of her own vanity and insecurities, a far more subtle and prolonged form of regicide. The letter also contained Elizabeth's own haunting analysis of how the insidious effects of lead poisoning had profoundly impacted her reign during her final years, clouding her judgment and diminishing her capacity to govern effectively. She openly acknowledged making decisions that she could no longer recall, signing documents that she later regretted, and issuing pronouncements that contradicted her earlier policies, attributing these alarming errors to what she hauntingly called the fog of metal in my mind, a chilling admission of her diminished mental state. Most shockingly of all, she confessed to experiencing periods of complete blackouts where she had absolutely no memory of hours or even days, raising the terrifying possibility that others had ruled in her name without her knowledge or consent, potentially undermining the legitimacy of her reign. Elizabeth's final written words were perhaps the most poignant and tragic of all, revealing the depth of her despair and regret. She hauntingly described herself as having become a ghost haunting my own throne, a prisoner of her own making, and expressed profound remorse about the sacrifices she had made in pursuit of an impossible ideal of eternal youth and beauty, recognizing the futility of her quest. The woman who had given her name to an entire age, who had steered England through tumultuous times and emerged victorious, concluded her reign by acknowledging that she had ultimately destroyed herself in service to an artificial image that was never truly real to begin with, a haunting epitaph to her life. The immediate and forceful suppression of this potentially explosive letter by James I and his advisors underscores the profoundly damaging nature of its contents and the threat they pose to the carefully constructed narrative of Elizabeth's glorious reign. The revelation that England's greatest queen had spent her final years slowly poisoning herself while potentially being manipulated by her own courtiers, raising questions of treason and conspiracy, would have irrevocably undermined the entire mythology that had grown up around Elizabeth's reign, shattering the carefully crafted image of Gloriana and exposing the dark undercurrents of Tudor politics. The incriminating letter vanished into the depths of the royal archives, where it remained hidden from public view for centuries, leaving only tantalizing rumors and whispered accounts of its potentially seditious contents to hint at the true horror and tragedy of Elizabeth's final days, fueling speculation and historical debate. On March 24, 1603, in the pre-dawn hours of a cold spring morning, Queen Elizabeth I drew her last agonizing breath in a chamber that had become a haunting monument to the vanity and self-deception that had slowly and inexorably consumed her life, a testament to the destructive power of societal pressures and personal insecurities. The room where she died was a disturbing tableau of artificial beauty, juxtaposed against the stark realities of natural decay, filled with distorted mirrors that reflected nothing but shadows and cosmetic implements that could no longer effectively disguise the horrifying truth of her ravaged condition, a scene of Gothic horror. The woman who had once commanded the seas, defied empires, and inspired generations died alone, save for a handful of terrified courtiers who were too repulsed by her appearance and haunted by her erratic behavior to approach her bedside, surrounded by the very tools that had contributed to her slow and agonizing demise. The final weeks of Elizabeth's life had been a grotesque parody of royal dignity, a macabre charade played out in the shadows of Richmond Palace. Unable to apply her usual elaborate makeup due to the crippling weakness in her hands caused by lead poisoning, she had been forced to surrender to the ministrations of her ladies-in-waiting, allowing them to paint her face each morning, though the resulting visage was more akin to a grotesque mask than a human likeness, a haunting symbol of her lost identity. The thick, suffocating layers of ceruse applied over skin that was now more scarred and lesioned than flesh created an appearance so profoundly disturbing that even her most loyal and devoted servants found it exceedingly difficult to look directly at her, averting their gazes in a mixture of pity and revulsion. The queen, who had once been universally praised for her captivating beauty, had become a living memento mori, a chilling reminder of human mortality dressed in the garish trappings of eternal youth, a haunting paradox. Elizabeth's death throes were made all the more horrific by the agonizing symptoms of acute lead poisoning that had finally reached a terminal stage, unleashing a torrent of physical suffering. She suffered from violent convulsions that caused her carefully applied makeup to crack and crumble away in grotesque pieces, revealing the raw, damaged skin beneath, a terrifying glimpse behind the facade. Her breathing became labored, shallow, and irregular, punctuated by moments where she would suddenly sit bolt upright in bed and speak in hushed tones to invisible figures, reliving past traumas and seemingly conversing with the ghosts that had haunted her final months with increasing frequency. So, as we've journeyed through the shadowed corridors of Richmond Palace and witnessed the tragic final act of Elizabeth I, a powerful queen brought down by a desperate dance with vanity and the insidious forces of her time, it becomes clear that her story is a cautionary tale. It's a poignant reminder that even the most formidable figures are vulnerable to the pressures of their era, and that the pursuit of external validation can come at a devastating price. Elizabeth's story, though steeped in the grandeur and intrigue of the Tudor court, is ultimately a deeply human one, filled with ambition, fear, and the haunting echoes of choices made under immense pressure. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this complex and compelling chapter of history. What struck you most about Elizabeth's story? Do you have any questions or insights you'd like to share? Please leave a comment below. I'm really keen to hear what you think and join the discussion. And if you found this deep dive into history fascinating, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future explorations of the past. There's always more to uncover and understand.